wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful
Guyana will become the next Dubai, and we, the citizens of Guyana, are super excited to benefit from our homeland the same way the citizens of Dubai benefit from theirs.
This is what life is like for citizens from the Emirate of
Guyana will become the next Dubai.
Guyana, with wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful Guyana.
So welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of Globespan 24x7, known and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh. And we have this evening our technical operator, Mr. Devin Bissoon. We are with our regular panel, minus one. This evening we are discussing democracy building and its challenges in Guyana. Joining us for this panel discussion is Mr. Vincent Alexander, Commissioner of GCOM, for lack of a better introduction. Mr. Ravindra Dev, former Member of Parliament and leader of the defunct ROAR of Guyana, and Professor Betaram Ramarak, who has been joining us regularly over the last few months. Gentlemen, thank you for taking your time out of your busy schedule to join us for this discussion tonight. We will begin with democracy building, and then we'll talk about the challenges in Guyana. So first, we'll ask the esteemed professor, Dr. Betaram Ramarak, who teaches political science, among other subjects, just to give us a definition. What exactly is democracy? Most of us, many of us, think democracy is you vote, and that's democracy. You're done with that.
Well, Vish, before I get into that, I just, I just want to make a comment about a previous show we had where I think the topic was about political morality and ethics or ethical behavior. In that program, I did make the comment that it is very difficult, to identify people who would fit this difficult description of being political leaders who are upright in terms of their moral and ethical behavior. And I did come up with a short list. I had Ashton Chase on that list and Chetty Jagan. So I have gotten a couple of emails since then about Ashton Chase. So with all due respect to Ashton, and we never want to speak ill, of the dearly departed, I am going to shorten that list, and I'm stuck with one, Chetty, on that list. And I'm sure there are many people in Guyana, but it's just that I cannot at this time think of anyone, given the criteria that we had established at, at that last session, that discussion. And again, with all due respect to Ashton Chase, I know he passed away a couple of days ago. One of the things that I find helpful or useful about him is trying to get a sense of a question that I've been trying to answer, but with feedback and responses from people within the PPP. And that question has always been, for me, why is it difficult at times for the PPP to acknowledge that there may be Indian issues that they have to confront? And I think Ashton Chase was one of the few people who, by the way, was very different from Chetty, Janet, and Hubbard, in the sense that Ashton was never really a doctrinaire Marxist. And I think when you read not just a book on trade union that he has written, but he has written two other important pieces. One is about the suspension of the Constitution in 1953, but he's also written another book assessing, I think it was published in 1994, assessing the Barnum years. And I think one of the clear statement that he made in answer to that question was that the PPP has always been unwilling from the inception to address Indian concerns or Indian issues simply because they do not want to be seen as an Indian political party. So I just wanted to make that point, and so we can move on. And I think it's important to make that point because the PPP is seen even today as a party that speaks for Indians, and I have some problem with that. It is a party that speaks for all Guyanese, or is attempting to speak for all Guyanese. So I will leave that at that. But I don't want to make this a long monologue. But to come back to the question you raised about democracy, I mean, there are lots of definition, and I guess you can place those criteria, so to speak, depending on where you are. Obviously, the European countries have had a long tradition of trying to work that question out. You know, they fought wars, they've redefined their boundaries and so on, going back to the 1600s. So democracy in that sense has been established in terms of, you know, having institutions. Like, for instance, here in the United States, people talk about the office of the president, not necessarily the person. Very different from where we are in the Caribbean. You know, personality is important. But the long of this, I'm just going to give you a couple of criteria, which I think maybe this can set the, you know, the scene for the discussion here. I would say there are, at least in terms of where we are in Guyana, there are 4 general criteria that I would attach to this whole notion of democracy. The first and foremost, I would think, which is on the minds of most people, and for a lot of people, this seems to be, if not the dominant, the only criteria, again, given our history, which is, you know, having free and fair elections. So I think that's crucial. I think we have kind of addressed this over the years. Hopefully we have settled this issue about national free and fair elections. There are complications. I'm sure Vincent will talk about those. And I think a second criteria I would add to this whole notion of, you know, what we mean by democracy is this whole notion of not having a government that has extensive or tremendous power. We've seen that, you know, from independence to 1992, we've had a very dominant authoritarian government. So powers of government has to be limited. I think that's a given in any kind of democracy. And I would add a third one, which is that, you know, when the election is over every 5 years, people have to live, right? You have to interact with others. You have to interact with the government. So the third criteria I would add here is that governments have to be responsive to the needs of their citizens. And however they do that in different ways, through organizations, and so on. So that's crucial. And I would add one more, which I think, you know, in every society that's democratic, you have to have certain basic freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and so on, because those things are crucial. Now, in some, I would say, you know, we're not a perfect state. You know, we're less than 60 years old. So we are, to borrow a phrase from Burroughs and Nascimento, named after Barnum's writings, we are still molding a nation, so to speak. But I think we've come a long way in establishing those criteria. And I will end by saying this. Since we're not a perfect democracy, it is a working democracy in my view. But we're also unique in the sense that, you know, out of the, I guess, the 200 countries out there, we are unique in the sense that we are a plural society. So my hope, and I think this will add to this whole notion of being a democracy, I think if 2 things can happen in the future, one would be this whole notion of coalition politics, right, as opposed to power sharing. And secondly, I do believe that because we are a plural society, we can benefit from what people have called, you know, sort of a broker institutions, where people of different communities, the Amerindians, for instance, I would love to see the Amerindians, you know, have a strong and vibrant organization that could voice their concern. So that's what I mean by broker institutions. So I know that's a lot. I'm gonna just leave it at that.
Okay, so let's ask Vincent Alexander if you can add to that.
Yes, I think that one starts off to speak about democracy from the standpoint of the individual. and the fact that the individual should have the matter of course certain freedoms. No one should really inhibit individual existence. Even as we say that no one should inhibit individual existence, we have to recognize that you don't exist in isolation to others, and therefore there must be some point at which there's an accommodation. So as your existence is not inhibited, don't inhibit the existence of others, and that you live in society as an individual, family, community, in a country, and that structures have to be developed to allow you to exercise that freedom whilst not interfering with the freedom of others, and therefore being able to have structured relations. So from that perspective, partly agreeing with what has been said before, I would speak of 3 pillars of democracy. First one is representativeness.
Yeah.
Just can't not have a system of representativeness, because in an attempt to realize our freedoms, we have to be making decisions, and society simply cannot collectively continue to make those decisions as they attempted in ancient times. And therefore, there has to be a body of people who make the decisions on behalf of society, who exercise in some regards sovereignty for the society. So representativeness is the first one, and that's associated with the whole question of election. Associated with the whole question of elections. And I'll give a caveat to that shortly. The second one is that having gotten this body of people who are attempting to create a system where you can realize your freedoms, then that body of people, they've got to be responsive, because they're not there on their own frolic. They're there to do things on behalf of people. Therefore, they have to be responsive to the people. So that having been elected, for example, they have to have a regime that is responsive to the people, because they're acting on behalf of people. And that's the second pillar, responsiveness. And the third pillar, I would say, is responsibility, responsible behavior. Responsible behavior. And in that regard, it is to say that there should be behavior that is predictable, behavior that is objective, therefore does not pit one person against the other or one group against the other, but seeks to deal with what's acceptable across the board. Being responsible means that the same norm should apply to different people in the same situation, so that the outcomes are predictable and the treatment is fair. So I would say those are the 3 pillars: responsiveness, representativeness, and responsible behavior. I'd go on to say that those are kind of concepts, kind of institutions, but for them to be operational, one has to go a little deeper. And I think in going deeper, one will recognize, well, representativeness requires an electoral system to get the people with who they represent them. Responsiveness requires relationships, things like the press and consultations, and allow people to share their views and their ideas. Also speaks about various groupings representing interests that can feed back into the system, so that the system can be responsive to people's interests at various levels, individual level, the community level, the sectoral level, whatever levels. And then in terms of responsible behavior, I think one here speaks to a very large extent for transparency, meaning that there are known rules apply various circumstances to decision making that ensures that decision making is fair, not subjective. I'll go on to say that in more concrete terms, that one can see good governance and the rule of law as being the mechanisms that really provide for all three. So that we talk about transparency under good governance, we talk about ethical behavior under good governance, we talk about inclusion under good governance, talk about accountability under good governance. And so those things are the actual mechanisms that ensure this system of democracy that is intended to protect the freedom of people as they operate in an arena where they do not interfere with the freedom of others. It is those systems that are at work to really make a democracy work. I said I would say something specific to the question of representativeness, to say that when one looks at governance systems I talk about, it talks about equity. How do you deal with situations where people are not on the same footing? People may be disabled, they may be minorities and things like that. There may be gender differences. How do you deal with that? It talks about equitable arrangements. I say that to say that what we have found in our system, given the plurality of our society, given that people have different heritages, and probably culturally maybe even be different, that we haven't built into our system the equitable mechanisms to ensure that the system in its decision making and its administration addresses the interests of all literally equal, given people's natural inequality. And I think our electoral system is the one that can best respond to that by virtue of providing for a regime of representatives who could ensure that there isn't one group or one set of people imposing their will or the dominance of the others. That is a kind of system that allows for the consideration to be given all decisions to be made in the interest of all. And there is where I think we have a peculiar problem. The electoral system that provides for majoritarian rule, therefore, in some regards, provides for exclusion, provides for domination, therefore does not provide for the real freedom that one could enjoy on an equal footing in a society where freedom cannot be absolute, has to be relative. It has to be relative in a way that's objective, in a way where it can be optimized.
Ravidev, very comprehensive. What would you like to add or detract from it?
Your mic.
You're muted. You're muted, Ravi. You're muted.
Yeah, my predecessors have been so prolix in their enunciations. I'm not sure where I could add. What I would like to do, though, is to hone in on both of them seem to be conflating liberalism, which is a form of democracy that was introduced by Britain, in Britain. And we got to make sure we do that because we have heard of the term illiberal democracies, which may seem like an oxymoron from the definitions we are offered here, but it's not really. So we got to delineate liberalism and its stress on individualism from what democracy is all about. And to do so, I want to come back to something that both Dr. Nehusi and I, we agreed on, that because of our colonial baggage, which we have talked about as coloniality, it still remains in our heads. We seem fixated to talk about this form of governance as if only from a Western perspective. But that Western perspective came out of a particular specific history that they universalized. So, for example, in coming out of the so-called Holy Roman Empire into the modern Europe, they had to use techniques of conquest, which came out of Christianity because they were doing it for the good of these people. So all of us, they dragged us here from Africa, India, China, wherever they could find bodies that they have already conquered and put in a certain stage of helplessness, and then told us now that they're doing all of this for our own good, and democracy being one of those good. So I think we got to be a little more contextually nuanced when we talk about this notion of democracy as a specific type of governance. So I would like to put that on the table. So with all of that said, since my predecessors talked about, in a sense, British liberalism, John Stuart Mills, for example, in looking at Guyana, he already predicted that democracy cannot exist in such a country because of its plural nature. So the form of democracy that Vincent and Beto are talking about in its pristine British sense assumed a homogeneity of the populace. They had to be already one people so they can have one destiny. But the fact of the matter is, and I want to come back to this, the whole colonial background that we have not only in Guyana, but in all of the colonies that the British and the other European powers left. We have this problem of dealing and trying to work with this thing called democracy within the situation we have found ourselves. And to me, I come now to our topic, democracy building and the challenges and its challenges, not only in Guyana, but we're very close to all the other countries, especially Africa. Hence, most of my allusions always is to countries like Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, and so on, because we share this heterogeneous population. So what does democracy mean for that? So I would like to start off there, because I think the greatest challenge in which, however we cut, slice, or dice the thing called democracy in its procedural aspect of elections versus its substantive aspect of what the people actually want, we have to be cognizant of what does the plural nature of our society mean within the context of those rules that we are trying to impose. I would just like to throw that out.
Okay. So Dr. Amrit, you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, well, I'm not, ruling out, what Dev is saying, but I've identified 4 criteria, right, which I think is helpful and is useful. But I did add in my comment that we are a plural society. First to begin, I don't think, whatever we're left with by the Europeans, we have to come back to our own lived experiences. We live in a Europeanized world, in a globalized community. So there are certain values that we have to share that has to be consistent, right, with what is established as these global norm, so to speak. But I did add in my comment that, we are a plural society and we have to recognize that. And so I want to expand on the two things that I suggested, which I think would be crucial, which is one would have been the broker institutions. And what I mean by that, I think that in itself, when I say broker, I'm referring to, the different ethnic community. We're not unique in this sense, Malaysia, Singapore, Trinidad, Suriname, these are all, ethnic communities, and they have found ways to coexist in this, this globalized environment, but they have adopted ways and means to address some of the local issues that they're faced with. A case in point, a lot of these Asian NICs, the newly industrialized countries after World War II, they were previous European colonies, but take Singapore, for example, or Malaysia, where you have ethnic communities coexisting. There, the government found it necessary to have some kind of dominant, sort of a control, like labor unions, for instance, were restricted in terms of what they could do for the long-term goal of having, being able to be developed. Like Singapore has gone through that process, but it is a much more refined democracy today. But it is also an economic giant. So, but my point is, with brokered institutions, I think those will address the issues that were raised about inclusion. If you have brokered organizations or institutions advising the government, for instance, whether it's IPADA-G or the Amerindian People Association, it means that those groups will represent their community's interests, and they can bring that to the table, and they can be addressed. And the other thing that I want to expand a little bit on is this whole notion of coalition politics. Coalition by itself implies that, well, in my mind, we are, the demographics of Guyana is changing. And what that means is whichever party has a majority, they can't get that 51% unless they kind of coalesce with some other. I think that's going to be the trend. We'll have to wait and see what the Bureau of Statistics give us in terms of the data. Yes, we know there are problems with the data system, as per Ramesh Gampat. But the point is, coalition politics can also be a way of creating a more inclusionary society. I'll give you a good example. I think one of the tragic failure in Guyana in recent years is this fellow by the name of Mr. Schuman, who came out with a big bang, pilot, came from Canada. I thought he would have been a good, credible candidate. I mean, we've had Amerindian candidate before. I think it was Mr. Hardy, who was the leader of GAP, right? To go back, people may not remember that. But in my mind, I thought Schuman would have been a person who could really, get the Amerindians together and be a voice. But this guy turned out to be, sad to say, a total failure. In that sense. So that's disappointing. And I think we have to think in terms of, if we're going to move forward, coalition politics is something that can work, but those things will have to be addressed, by constitutional changes and so on. So the system I'm envisioning in my mind will also include recognition, again, that we are a plural society. And I'm always coming back, Vincent will talk about the number of African organizations that are part of IPADA-G, but we need to have similar, kind of organization that speaks to the concerns of other ethnic groups. The Amerindians, I think, would be crucial. Speaking on behalf of Indians also would be crucial. And I think once those ideas, the way we are doing it here, not the way David Hines was doing it in the last 3 shows that he had, but the way we're doing it here, if we're bouncing off ideas among each other, and looking for those, commonalities, so to speak, I think we can move forward. I don't think the current climate, allows for that to happen, because when you look at the rhetoric on both sides, um, to me, it's much more extreme than where we were in the 1960s. Which is really a sad situation. But I do believe that Guyana, the dynamics we're seeing, the economic changes and so on, I do believe, and I am hopeful that we're going to see some of those changes, but a greater move towards, being inclusionary. I think the Amerindians are going to be much more vocal, given, the recent events that affect their community. I think the COI that that Joe Singh is going to head off, I think it will reveal a lot of things that will convey to the Amerindians, that maybe, hey, they ought to be more politically organized so that they can have a voice that can speak on behalf of their community, right? So I'm basically saying that we can't throw away this whole liberal, world in which we're living. It's a world created for us, whether we like it or not. And we have to live in that world, but we have to take our own conditions we are living in, to try to find those commonality, right? So that we can kind of coexist inclusively as a people.
So Vincent, just in response to Ravi and him, I think you were getting to the point of it must be an all-inclusive democracy, if I understand you correctly. So you want to add to that and respond to what the two previous speakers said?
Let me respond, adding to that and what has been said by Ravi and Beto. I did say that when we were talking about elections or electoral system, here I was getting into the Guyana scenario. The electoral system does not respond to what could be democratic in the context of our plural society. So in some regards, I accept what Ravi is saying about the local conditions. But there's something Ravi said that is critical, and that is that notwithstanding the system we may have presently, there are aspects of our traditions, our heritage, which we've brought into the present system, whether it's consciously or otherwise. The African Guyanese may have brought a personality and a psyche. The Indo-Guyanese might have brought a personality and a psyche that do not necessarily reflect the kind of homogeneous environment that this liberal democracy assumes. And that is why I refer to the electoral system. Suffice to say that we live in a global environment where, to a very large extent, this liberal democracy has prevailed and has only been juxtaposed seriously to democratic centralism. Only been juxtaposed to democratic centralism. So that we have to look at the reality of this universal, more or less emergent or system in the context of globalization, and look to the whole question of localization. Because when one talks about culture, it could be political culture, all sorts of culture, there are things that are local and peculiar, and there are things that are universal and are owned by everyone. They may have the origin in one or the other place, but because of their usefulness and otherwise, they may be owned by all. So in many regards, we've come to a point where democracy we're talking about is, in a sense, kind of owned by all. But I think we have to be conscious that in the instances of poor societies, people who brought traits and heritages and other things that have to be taken into consideration when the system is finally, quote unquote, configured, if it's going to work in the context of the protection of freedom of the individual, to which I initially referred, because I think that's the base. That's the base, that every individual is born and really no one else has a right to impose on that individual. And that is only restrained by the fact that the individual himself can't impose on others, and therefore there must be some constraint that allows for coexistence with the optimization of one's individual being. I wouldn't want to call it individualism, but I would want to refer more to individuality as opposed to individualism. Because I don't think individualism takes into consideration the existence of others. It's a kind of an imposition of oneself. But individuality recognizes the peculiarity of an individual, including what he or she may be entitled to vis-a-vis the wider society, and therefore the basis for coexistence. I think in the Guyana context, we therefore have to look at what is it that is different in our plurality that we bring to this universal system. And also, what is it that has become entrenched? Because when one looks to Guyana, all of us tend to say things about democracy. But one can identify that historically, even though this democracy is supposed to be of the British, that the British themselves did not practice that democracy here in a manner in which they practice it there. And so that there are some peculiarities here that have become ingrained that in fact fly in the face of that universal and that original or that liberal democracy which we're talking about. You know, British didn't cultivate a pure image of their democracy because of the colonial system that itself contradicts what democracy provides for. I mean, democracy provides for representation, and they didn't start off with representation. They started off imposing themselves on a larger number of people. So certainly, what has been developed here in some regards conflicts with even that liberal understanding of democracy. And added to that, we have had situations where political parties have taken it onto themselves in this attempt to decolonize, take it onto themselves to look at other models. And so we see, for example, the People's Progressive Party speaks about democratic centralism, though at the national level they may articulate about democracy. Go to the Congress, they tell you that they have still not given up on Marxism as the ideology that drives them. And one could well find sufficient practices to say that they are driven by that, and therefore they are not driven by liberal democracy, they're driven by democratic centralism, though they may articulate liberal democracy. Therein lies our challenges. The difference we have brought to this thing called democracy from our historical being in one instance, from the impurities, so to speak, that the British colonization has embedded in our systems, and from ideologies that we have adopted that are not at one with the liberal democracy. Therein, to a very large extent, lies challenges, given the fact that we are not homogeneous, we are heterogeneous, and therefore have to take that into consideration, because one must bear in mind that when democracy started, it really started in homogeneous societies to the extent that some people were not people. You know, it's only a particular class who were part of that system. And so as it expanded, it went beyond that. But I would say that the colonizers have found ways in their own systems to deal with some of the problems going beyond that pure one-class system, that they have not, in fact, ingrained and embedded what they practice here, and we've inherited that. Therefore, that poses a challenge among the other challenges which I referred to.
I think that's a very elaborate explanation and amplification of the points made by both you and Ramrak. Ravidev, what do you think?
Well, I think now we're getting somewhere. Both of my interlocutors have now agreed that we can't just talk about democracy, in some platonic sense of forms, complete forms out hanging up in space there. We got to concretize it. And both speakers have now conceded that what the British preached was not what they practiced, but the premises of what they spoke on were based on imposing inequality. So I would like to come back to Beto's allusion to what we may call, what he referred to as successful democracies. And we talked about Malaysia. Let's start with Malaysia. First of all, Malaysia, their political system, the British accepted that the parties were ethnic parties. So when UNMO, the coalition of parties, came together, it was explicitly a Malay element of the Bumiputras, the Malays native. There were the Chinese, and you had the Indians to form UNMO, right? Singapore, of course, had broken away, and they wouldn't go down that road. And I want to come back to Singapore, which is held up as this model of success. So we come back to Malaysia, that there was an explicit acceptance of identitarian politics. And therefore, when the proverbial stuff hit the fan in 1969 and they had riots, they worked out a new economic program, the NEP, which very frankly addressed the conflicts that had burst open in the open. And for example, us as ROAR only was formed when in 1998, our stuff hit the fan and you had violence in the streets of Georgetown. And we came out explicitly and asked that we use this occasion why one set of Guyanese would beat up on another set of Guyanese and to grapple with the fundamental issues. But both of the major parties, the PNC and the PPP, refused to accept the premises. In fact, Mr. Hoyt overtly in the newspapers questioned my notion of what do you mean they are African Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese. No such thing, Mr. Hoyt explicitly said, and is there in the Starbuck News. So to come back to it, we see that the people who were successful in Malaysia, which came out, they're having some problems now because I think they're veering away from the premises, but very successfully they accepted the plural nature and dealt with it outside of the liberal paradigm. Similarly, Singapore. Singapore, for all intents and purposes, is an authoritarian state. And there are studies coming out now which shows that Lee Kuan Yew, behind the scenes, manipulated the immigration into Singapore to ensure that at all times there was a Chinese supermajority of 70%. Very few people talk about that. So having a Chinese supermajority and having their ethos dictate policies and to go along with, we're going to talk about cultural, and hopefully we're going to insult anybody, but they had a Confucian notion of how you are to govern yourself and so on, and they were able to move ahead like that. Do we have that here? And we come into the present, where the darling of the British, and the British has just accepted, is interestingly Rwanda. Rwanda, after a genocide in 1994, where 800,000 Tutsis were killed and floated down the river. Paul Kagame is now the darling. He has now been accepted into the Commonwealth, which was British to begin with, because he has brought stability. But how has Kagame brought stability to Rwanda? Certainly not in a liberal standpoint. He has taken a different approach now. In Rwanda, it is forbidden to you to mention your ethnic group in public. You cannot say or write or in any way say that I am a Tutsi or I am Hutu. You know how you can't be done. You'll be thrown into jail. Talk about the opposition there, but yet they're the darling. They are now the example of what Africa should be. So the point I want to make is that there are all these contradictions, right? And we have to then talk for Guyana. What is our reality, and how do we deal with our diversity in Guyana? What we have tried to beat to death, and I have since 2009, that when after our coalition with GAP, went to the polls in 2006, and I went around this country, we saw the changing demographics. There was no more inbuilt Indian majority for the PPP to get back into office. So as we said, the African security dilemma had been addressed, which is Mr. Burnham could justify with a straight face that he had to fiddle with the constitutional arrangements, or else African Guyanese would have been perpetually out of office, and that's not quote unquote just. So to come back to it, I want to now close by saying this, that we are at a rather fortuitous circumstances in how we instill democracy here. One of the proponents of democracy, the one I have followed since I came back here, was Donald Horowitz, who studied and wrote the magisterial ethnic groups in conflict, and he had proposed that one of the ways we can do it is for one of these ethnic parties, or each of the ethnic party, to reach across the divide, to address the concerns, the interests, the fears, especially the fears of the other side. And in that sense, while you may still have an ethnic base, you are conceding that there are others in the society that have a different viewpoint, and bring them in. Where we have differed in Roar, which Vishnu said is extinct or defunct, I think was the word.
Defunct.
If WPA can still survive, maybe Roar can still survive. And the point I want to make is that we have suggested that we in Guyana, if the political parties want to move ahead, they should concede within their parties ethnic censuses, ethnic caucuses within their party. So coming back to Beto and to Vincent's point, that you must have these different groups express their concern out of their lived experience, which they have shown to what Dyson in America called their linked fate, right? Every African Guyanese, I don't care from which strata or he comes from, understands at some level, or else he's a fool, or Indian Guyanese is the same thing, that their fates are in some way linked. That's how people see them. That's how people react to them. Therefore, if you have within the party an ethnic caucus, right? That caucus can meet outside, like the Black Caucus meets in the US, in the Democratic Party, and meet outside and talk about the concerns. So when they go back to the party, those that they represent can say, you know what, these people represent me. I think this will be our unique contribution to the challenge of building democracy in Guyana for us to move forward and may prove to be a model in other plural societies. But here again, I said this is due to the fortuitous fact that we have, and we are now a nation of minorities, and each party can do it. They may not, I think Vincent has made this point, they may not be starting from equal points in terms of resource or what other thing, but you can now work on it. And I think we can get there. I think we ought to seize this opportunity and make a common call for this. I'll end with this. When I was in the opposition, I once spoke about this to Mr. Hoyt, and Mr. Hoyt felt it was something that needs to be considered. And he said he would take it back to the party. In 2001, I think Vincent had left by then. Vincent, were you still in there?
2007.
Okay. Right. So Vincent was still there. So I don't know if it actually taken, but my contact was Derek Bernard, and we would talk outside of my meetings like that, and we had a tremendous amount of things. So when Mr. Corbyn took over, and when I know Vincent wasn't there anymore, we spoke about this. And in fact, his complaint was that in his party, and I will not name him, he said, man, when these Indians come into the PNC, he said, when they go on a stage, they're more Rasta than he. You know how? Yeah, I never forgot that phrase, that they become more Rasta. Huh?
JK.
Boy, don't put me in trouble.
Don't name anybody.
Don't put me in trouble, boy. So he said there are people more Rasta than he. So there is still all these things, but I'll close with that. I think we have a way forward that we can contribute to this challenge, and successfully so.
Well, you know, in the US, in Congress, there are ethnic caucuses. In fact, the Democratic Party has ethnic caucuses, Asian caucus, Black American or African American caucus, and a Hispanic caucus. So yeah. So Ramrak, you want to comment on that or anything else?
No, I mean, there are a couple of things. I know we've talked about democratic centralism and PPP maintaining the concept of socialism. So maybe, Vincent, you know, Karl Marx did make the argument that society has to reach a certain level of development, and then the revolution will come after. So maybe the PPP is still holding out that at some point, once the economy develops, they may move to establish that socialist state. But you know, on a more serious note,
the quantitative will change the qualitative. I'm using Vincent's word.
Yeah. But yeah, certainly, you know, the British have done things to us that they haven't done for themselves, and I think one of the things that stands out in our history is this whole, you know, notion of PR. One of the things that Chetty had said in '63 was, "Here's the British, you know, are imposing PR, but it's something that's foreign to them. So why the heck are they doing it to us?" And obviously the point he was trying to make is that they were trying to keep him out of power, and don't let him govern an independent country. But you know, to come back to what we're talking about here, yes, I do. And, you know, I was a member of ROAR also, so I do share the same philosophy that Dev is talking about. You know, we've talked about this whole notion of, the ethnic caucus, and I think that can fit in to what I'm talking about in terms of the broker institutions. When I use the concept of coalition, I'm not talking about a coalition, you know, of convenience as you had with the PNCUF. I'm talking about a coalition that could possibly also be ethnic based. So if the Amerindians, as I said, could form their own political party, you know, they are 13% of the vote. So that's a tremendous broker institution, or a power broker, if you want to call it that. And yes, there are the other things that we've talked about, you know, the whole notion of affirmative action, you know, balancing and distribution of power from away from the center. Yes, and all of those things I think will help. But I see two fundamental problems here. And one is the whole notion of dialogue, right? I mean, the rhetoric seems to be so far apart. How do we get you know, these, I guess, so-called ethnic organizations to begin to have that conversation? And I've said before, sometimes you need that outside party. You know, the US came in 91, 92 to help us fix a problem, and then they came back again 2020 So maybe we need an outside, power broker, to fix this broken marriage. Maybe a CARICOM, intervention. So we are far apart from that reality. And I think, secondly, if we're going to go that route to talk about ethnic caucus and so on, there has to be a recognition among the plural communities that you have specific, issues to address. And I think this is something that I do respect David for saying, which is that he's always said that, as an African, I feel comfortable speaking about the concerns of Africans. So my fundamental question here for us to move from level A to level B is who speaks for the Indians, who speak for the Amerindians. So we don't have that. We don't have any Ipadaji, to advocate for a voice for the Indians or a strong Amerindian voice. So to get to that level where we can have that recognition that we are a plural community and we have legitimate organizations that can speak on behalf of those different lived experiences, and then try to come up, with solution in this globalized community in which we live, or this local community we call Guyana. We're not there yet. And so I don't know how we can get to that level. So that's my dilemma in looking at this situation. So maybe you two boys can help me.
Yeah, let's ask Vincent. How do we get to that level?
How do we make any policy?
I'm not sure if it's on this program. I have, on previous occasions, spoken to what Ravi talked about, what we now calling these ethnic caucus in the various parties. This is something I advocated in the People's National Congress during the period of Hoyt. I don't remember him bringing it, but I remember taking it to him that what we needed was that when we had Indo-Guyanese, for example, joining the party, they should not join the party to become Rastas. They should join the party to bring into the party the concerns of the people of Indian descent, so that when the party prepares its program reflects national concerns and concerns of the various sectors, the various ethnic groups, and that we create one program to deal with all of that. So I think that is something that we should be working towards in the political parties. But the question is, are the political parties disposed to doing that?
Vincent,
However,
was the R supposed to achieve that? PNC R?
I don't think it was ever properly articulated sufficiently. I don't think so. I think those things may have, the R was, there were two R's. There were two R's. First, there was the PNC stroke R, where the R was a party in its own right. So that yes represented that possibility. Then the PNC changed its name to PNCR, no stroke, right? So it reformed itself rather than joined with reform. And said that anyone who was a member of reform, which could retain its own identity, would also be a member of the PNC. So I don't think that quite worked out. So that, yes, I'm saying on one hand, this question of the caucus and recognizing that there are ethnic differences and that in our governance, in our programs, we must recognize that and address them so that we don't have conflict, and that to me would start to reduce, in fact, the nature of the party insofar as people only vote because of its ethnicity. Because I still feel that to a very large extent, when I've looked at the last local government elections, one can see the extent to which ethnic voting has prevailed in those elections. You can still go to Mocha Arcadia, The PVP hasn't won a single constituency. They still go to Linden, they've lost the one they used to win. Then when you go to PVP constituencies, the same thing. So the ethnic voting, for me, this crossover thing is problematic for two reasons. One, the numbers game, I still don't see the crossover having the impact that you're referring to. But it is not only a matter of the numbers, it's a matter of the psyche that drives the party. So even if a party has a crossover into it, how does it get that crossover? And does that party, in terms of its psyche and therefore its policies, its outlook, represent something national, or does it still represent the particular dominant ethnic group, although there is a crossover? And when one speaks to the way in which PVP has been able to get African Guyanese into the party, there's no issue there of crossover as such. There are all sorts of things that are done to get them there that doesn't change the site of the party. But I feel, however, that if we start to look at our society, again, from the individual to the family, to the community, and to society at large, and we configure our policies to allow sufficient freedom of the individual without being interfered with, the family without being interfered with, the community without being interfered with, and at the national level, we deal with things that are common. You know, I'm talking about real decentralization, real returning to the individual as the prime unit in society, that we can build a system that does not lend to the level of conflict ethnic conflict that we have, because our demography helps it. Our demography helps it. We still live in enclaves, and if we have individuals doing their thing, families doing their thing, and communities doing their thing, and we limit what is done nationally to things that have to be done nationally, and at that level seek to have negotiations how we run the affairs consensually, probably at that level have the kind of power sharing arrangement. That too is possible. And the beauty about that is that we already have structurally the individual, family, the community, and society at large. So in a sense, we have the structural arrangements. It's now to apply the exercise of authority to those levels in a manner that does not result in ethnic conflict.
Okay, Ravi. I mean, he has been very, very extensive, comprehensive, and he also makes reference to power sharing as well.
Well, this is why we can't get caught up on terminology. You know, I think we should look a little more, not just, as I said before, at ontological, definitional ontology, but in terms of real, what is there, what is beneath all of this. And now that I've stepped off any kind of, role on that stage, I've been doing a lot of work in my own village, for instance, and I have gone back to after emancipation, like in most of the plantations, the Africans, at that time, Iflat was a coffee plantation, and they had about less than 300 African slaves, and some of them moved out to the front where the public road is, and we call that the village. Sometimes it's called Casho, but it's not really Cash, but that's another story. One point I want to make, I went into that area, having left over 56 years. I literally had lived in that section and met some old friends, and we grounded. And there's no question that one can see the different needs of the different groups within a particular village, even a village, at a village level. You can see the particular needs And we have to be very honest about ourselves and to accept that one shoe ain't gonna fit all. And so we have to, not in any idealistic sense, but in a practical sense, we have to get much more granular in terms of getting to the people there, in terms of having them exercise power over their own lives. And to me, I come back, therefore, to democracy. Demos, the people. How do the people, all agglomeration of people, you'll have power differentials. It's almost inevitable. You can, even in a home, as we know, there's that power differential, which females are now trying to balance a little more fairly. And we have to accept in Guyana, even at the village level, much as at the national level, there are these need for balancing. So if we begin there, and this is why I want to challenge this, just like we are making a proposal about caucuses, but it'll be up to the two major parties as to whether they want to adopt this. And come back to that, omnibus term power sharing, which, people don't like to pin down on. The problem with this idealistic notion of everybody sitting around a table and we'll all be, bonhomie and we all sort out matters. In reality, the number one problem with that, historically, our friend Horowitz comes up with three objections. And the first one is adoptability, whether it will be adopted. That these major parties have always shown themselves unwilling to adopt moves in that direction. So even after Mr. Hoyt belatedly said he had a Damascene moment, seen the light. I don't know if he had a voice booming from heaven, but he did change his mind at the last moment, but that went nowhere. It's the one, how do these major parties adopt it? Because there's this human, it seems to be in our human nature that if you have even a slim opportunity of having total power, you'll go for that rather than a greater benefit if you were to share. It didn't happen. As late as 2015, with a straight face, the new PNC or AFC coalition actually went down and bargained in which power would have been shared in the new arrangement. Didn't happen. And with a straight face, Mr. Green said, well, I didn't realize the Constitution didn't allow me to share a little more power with the PM, Moses. Come on, we got to go beyond that. So the point is of adoptability. So our proposals, I think, will founder on adoptability. We may blame it on democratic centralism. We may blame it on, authoritarianism in the PNC because of their heritage, whatever you may want to put it on. But I think it's almost a non-starter. So how do we then move forward? And this is where I believe that groups such as Vincent's and others can actually go to the people in these villages, starting with, let's say, in the African community, this Emancipation Day. Let a new message go out there of self-emancipation. I don't want to go down that road as to what the heck was emancipation. I always hate using that word, emancipation. It's a hollow term that was, beyond cynical to be used by the British. But be as it may, I think we got to have programs that can literally empower people. And at last, we have the rationale. Today, my fridge having some problems. My air conditioner would have a problem. In my village here, we don't have technicians who can repair these things. We need to do practical things like getting boys and girls of our own village to emancipate them by getting them to learn trades. The facilities are available. I want to be a little practical here, that there are things that we can do, because it's been shown that once individuals begin to move out of their basic needs, that somebody got to hand it to them, they will begin to think a little more independently. So I would like to stop here to say there's an opportunity outside of the political parties for work to be done, to get our people on this road to seeing their commonalities.
Okay, so Ramrak, we don't have much time left, so if you could just summarize and let's close off with Vincent being the next presenter.
Yeah, well, I want to come back to what I started out saying with the 4 criteria that I listed in terms of, our democracy, right? Which is the whole notion of, the election, government being responsive to people, people have certain basic rights, and of course, limited government. And I think, we are in a much better place today than where we were previously. I don't know how far you want to go back, but I'm going to summarize this by saying that, it's a work in progress. We are molding a nation. And I think all the issues that we discuss here today, it has to continue, but it has to continue with an understanding that, we are a plural society. And I would love to see, for instance, on this panel, having someone from the Amerindian community who can speak, to their lived experiences. And it doesn't have to be a male. Male, it seems to be, the dominant force here on these shows. So I am hopeful, and hopefully we can see these changes in the future. And I will leave it at that.
Vincent?
Ravi talked about the problem of man being naturally greedy. That is one view. There are other views which says man is naturally reasonable. So I think we have to appeal to the reasonable man. I think one of the bases for appealing to the reasonable man, Ravi mentioned it, he has to be at a certain level of comfort. Then the reasonable man may prevail. But I think that in some regards, that's where we have to go to appeal to the reasonable man. And I think we have the kind of natural contours that can lend to an organization of the society that relieves us the kind of problem we have, where we are competing at the top for all that there is. If we can share from the bottom down, from the bottom up, what there is, with the reasonable man being the center of the action.
Okay, anything else to add? Ravi, any final word?
I just conclude with that when I came back in 1988, having quit my job in the States to return to Guyana, I had read Rodney's piece. He had been interviewed by Andrew Sawkey, I believe, Georgetown Journal. And this was 1970, where Rodney had talked about the fact that let's accept that Guyana still is a divided society, and how do we move forward? And he talked about forming organizations within the different enclaves and work with them at the level that we are talking about, of literally building them. And like I said, we have much more opportunities for that building at a very concrete level where the person can actually live better. And we have to start with those physiological needs before even moving to the psychological, because they impact on them. So we have an opportunity with this newfound wealth that's out there to start at that level. And when I returned, I worked, this is ironic when I hear David talking about nowadays some of the things, that I worked with the WPA. I went there, and in fact, I asked Mr. Guyana if there's we're going to work in the Indian community. We didn't come back for politics. What group is there in the African community? Because we had heard of a 1st of August. But I was never introduced to that group. It was probably maybe they weren't vibrant or what have you. But be as it may, that has always been our constant hope, that there can be groups outside of the political parties, which are driven by other political logic. Politics has its own logic. And let's not try to discount that. That's a logic, and that has to do with power and possession of power and all the kind of thing. Vincent may be wearing his rose-tinted glasses and talking about the reasonable man, you know, but I am not. I'm a realist, and I think we got to go with, you know, what realism has taught us, and we are in a real politic world right now. So I think I still go back to Rodney's proposal that I put into the public arena back in the 90s, that let groups that are working within these communities, that are trusted in these communities, let them continue. Let us assist each other. For example, on West Coast, we can form one trade school that form like in IFLAT here. It's not only I have problems with my fridge, you know, out in the African section, there's that. So we can have boys from both sections learn these type of things, and in doing so, begin to work together, not at this theoretical level like we are doing here, at a very concrete level. Because I'll part with this. I met an old friend. I hadn't met him for like 50 years, and he and I chatted and all that. And he asked me about a brother of mine that he remembers. They had both worked in IFLAT sugar factory. And it's that human connection that we need to bring up, and it's there in the village, and we need to fan those embers, and you come out. Now, I'm a village boy, so I don't know if the same thing happened in, was it Pakudam, Vincent?
Where it came from.
Yes.
Unlike okay. You, I'm not in Pakudam.
Is that the place they call here, Pontrench or something like that? Are you from there?
That's another area. Pontrench is different. Pontrench is where they now have that splendid road.
That boulevard. And where's Pakudam?
Pakudam is between Princess and Hatfield, Louisa Row, and Vincent.
Okay, good. That's what I mean. That you have these neighborhoods even in the city. You know how that have their own little culture that we can bring together. I close with that. I'm hopeful.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time this evening. I believe that would be the last word for this evening. And we look forward to seeing you all again in a couple of weeks, we hope. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us tonight and watching Globespan 24x7, owned and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh. And thank you, Devin Bissoon, for your technical assistance and support.